Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew Claudel, and I'm really happy to be joining you tonight for this conference organized by Strelka Institute called In the City. So, a few years ago, I co founded a program at MIT called DesignX, which deals with innovation in the human environment. And working in this space, I started noticing an emerging related to technology and to governance in cities. So, we don't know how to think about value. We don't even know how to define value in cities, let alone how we can govern that value and how we can govern the technologies that are creating value in new ways in cities. This space used to be defined by economic markets and democratic states, but it's not really working anymore. And so cities around the world are experimenting. And my current research and design work focuses on this idea of urban experimentation. So first off, some terms. People need to eat and sleep and move around in cities. This is like terrifically obvious, and obvious. I had to come all the way from MIT to tell you this. But in any case, people need to eat and sleep and move around, and technology is the thing that makes it possible to eat and sleep and move around. Technology, in other words, is how the value of a city is realized. And when we think about technology in cities, we need to think about design and deliberation. We need to think about these creative functions. And we also need to think about how that technology is diffused into cities and how it's regulated. These are more governance functions. And these four themes are going to recur throughout my presentation. But to give a concrete example, city technology is, in most societies anyway, there are these agreed upon expectations and governance systems for urban technology. City technology is created and governed in these specific ways under certain regimes. So you can think of a housing market, but also subsidized housing. There's a road network for private cars, and there's also public transit. This system has never really been perfect, but it's a system that deals with known value. Diagrammatically, you can think of it like this. We think of the market and the private sector doing the design and the deliberation side of things. And we think of the public sector deliberating the future of our society and regulating technology. So as we move forward from now into the future, the direction of progress is defined by the relationship between these two sectors. It's sometimes tense, and there's sometimes pressure between them, especially around regulation and diffusion, but there's this forward motion defined by the state market system. But throughout the 20th century, two trends started accelerating. This is not going to be new to anyone. This is obvious. But throughout the 20th century, there was a trend of austerity in government, and there was a trend of a technology-oriented society. So here you can see total US government spending had a kind of upward arc, and this trend was crystallized during the financial crisis of 2009. So after the financial crisis, there's a sharp sort of plateau in government spending. Meanwhile, right around the same time, between 2001 and 2014, venture capital, which is an indicator of the technology orientation in society, really heavily invested in technology. So you can see right in the same time frame, there's a little drop during the financial crisis, but immediately venture capital picks up again. So it's one thing to look at this in graphs. It's actually a lot easier to just look at it in terms of The Economist covers, which is a good barometer for the economic zeitgeist of the world. On the left, you have a cover that says "Stop the backlash against big government." Right, we're feeding this big government machine. And on the right, you can see a cover that says "Set innovation free." This idea that innovation is really what's going to direct society. Now, when these two trends come together in cities, when austerity in government and technology-oriented economies sort of begin acting on cities, you get this unique kind of platform technology that emerges. Again, another cover of The Economist magazine, Uber world, the race to reinvent transport. And Uber is just one example of a whole slew of platform technologies in cities. After this financial crisis, there was a race to reinvent urban systems. You see, the Uberization of everything. Now, returning to these 4 dimensions, platform technology operates on design. It fractionalizes physical assets in space or time. You can think of Airbnb rooms that fractionalize a physical room in time, so different people can use it at different times of the month and months of the year. It operates on deliberation. No longer are we able to decide, hey, this is an urban mobility system that we like. Instead, you have this permissionless deployment agenda. This is the move fast and break things kind of ethos. And this is so common that to Uber a city actually begins to mean something. It's a phrase that a lot of policymakers start using. Diffusion is about scaling up and network effects in cities. So as these companies deploy, they're really looking for two-sided platform network effects, and that makes them scale very quickly. And finally, regulation. So in most cases, regulation is outdated or ineffective, and for whatever reason, it can't really grip onto these new platform technologies that are emerging in cities and creating a new type of value in cities. So again, I mentioned both of these, and they're obviously really overused. But the best examples of this are Uber and Airbnb. They're emblematic of a digital platform economy in cities. They've had very real impacts on cities in terms of traffic and land value and tourism tax. And they've also changed how entrepreneurs and how public officials think about creating and governing value in cities. It's changed how people think about the relationship between different sectors. So all of a sudden, this market state framework that we had before, this framework that defines the arrow of progress, it no longer applies. Throughout the 20th century, with this trend of austerity and this trend of technification and the rise of platform technologies, things shift. So design and diffusion are rapid. It's the move fast and break things motion. And government continually lags behind. So deliberation is no longer about setting the best possible futures for our society. It's about squabbling over the things that are already being deployed in cities. Like, how do we deal with Uber? And this misaligned pace means that regulation is lagging further and further behind. So there's a kind of leverage gap. There's a futurability gap in terms of thinking about our best possible futures, and a leverage gap in terms of regulating the technologies that are already deploying into cities. So the overall outcome is that the progress of society in the direction, is set by the market. So in sum, this market state framework for creating and governing value is no longer effective. And I don't believe that we should grip onto the old system. I don't think we should return to this previous market state framework, because it's just not going to work. It's not going to work in today's technology context. And I think it would require that we would forgo a lot of the opportunity that technology can bring. So the only way out is through. The question is, should urban experimentation be part of that path? And that's what we're thinking about today. This is all beta. Cities around the world, technologists, city governments across sectors are coming together around this concept of experimentation. The concept is being taken up, and it's being used to resolve emerging issues around technology in cities. So I'm acutely concerned with, what does this concept make possible? What kind of things are starting to happen because we have this new thought about experimentation in cities, an emerging mode of practice? So we started looking at different cities around the world about this rise of urban experimentation. This is just a handful of some that we found in a collaborative research that I'm doing with Dark Matter Labs based in London. And we've started to notice a few things. The first is that experimentation is particularly active in real property and mobility. Again, returning to the Uber and Airbnb example. So in real property, experimentation really took off during and after the financial crisis. This is when development projects fell through, or they were put on hold, or their financing ran out, which lowered the threshold for doing an experiment. And it opened up the door to alternative land uses. And this is right around the time when the innovation economy was going mainstream. So people were starting to think, hey, there's this new economy, there's this new mode of practice, and maybe that deserves a space in our alternative land use projects. The second is mobility. So in mobility, geolocated ride-hailing services really started taking off. Everyone had a smartphone, and these applications lowered the cost and increased the predictability of getting a ride. So all of a sudden, you see mobility shift from a story about vehicles. The value is no longer in vehicles. The value is in individual rides. Also in mobility, there was a particularly acute Uber effect. After Uber deployed in a lot of cities, they felt like they got burned, and they saw experimentation now as a tool to develop regulation a little faster, as a tool to control technology companies. So all of these experiments are starting to happen in different cities. And I think that there's no kind of single practice, there's no theory of urban experimentation that exists today. And there's no agreed upon set of tools or theoretical position. All these experiments are ad hoc, they're contextual, they're unique, they're based on the specific rules and the specific conditions of every city. So the only way to understand them is to observe them in the wild. So starting with the definition of an urban experiment, this is an intentional and bounded intervention in the public way. So in public space or in laws or things politically that affect everyone. These interventions are with new technologies or systems. They involve several stakeholder groups in the public, private, third sector, and they aim to evaluate the effects of that intervention. So before I share specific examples of these experiments, I want to show a bit of a framework that we've developed so far. So there are three conditions that seem to be prompting experiments, situations that cause policymakers or technologists to begin experimenting. These are imminent technology, so anticipating the diffusion of an established technology. Think about autonomous vehicles or drones. A lot of cities are thinking, okay, we need to do an experiment because we know this technology is coming down the pipeline at our city. The second is emerging technology. So this is cities thinking about how do we support projects that appear promising? How do we look at the technologies that are emerging in our city and support them through offering an opportunity to experiment? Think new ideas spinning out of MIT that I've worked with a lot, or citizen initiatives around like a new cooperative vehicle sharing platform. And thirdly, solicited technology. So this is when cities are trying to solve a specific challenge that's known and using an experiment to sort of enable experimentation toward a solution to that challenge. There are four typologies of experiments that seem to be most common. The first is an exploration, kind of a pilot project or co-creation. The second is an exception. So when cities carve out a sandbox for experimentation and invite different market actors, for example, different startups to play in that sandbox. You see this happening a lot with scooter companies or dockless bike companies. Cities will say, hey, there's an experimental sandbox and we're inviting multiple providers to play in that. I'll share an example of that later. You also have negotiation. So provisional policy or a contract that's very specific. It's bounded. It's a one-to-one relationship. It looks a little bit like a public-private partnership, and it maybe offers regulatory exemption for the purposes of a specific experiment. And finally, you see initiation. So this is permissionless deployment, a rogue deployment. This is most commonly thought of as the kind of Uber approach, but it actually happens in cities too. In some cases, cities preemptively launch a policy, and that's a bit of an initiation approach that I'll share an example of later as well. So returning diagrammatically to this market state system, experimentation is restructuring that framework, and it's pushing into the future in a different way. So experimentation is a bit of a sphere that pushes forward into the future. It's a site for the market and the state to mutually design and deliberate technology. Technology begins being diffused through an experiment. You see emerging patterns of use. People start kind of building a technology into their day-to-day life. And municipalities can begin developing appropriate regulations. So they're kind of prototyping policy or figuring out the appropriate thresholds for a license to operate a particular company. So it's in some ways realigning the governmentality of technology. It's allowing both sides of this system to work together at a more even pace. Okay, so enough of these abstract ideas. I'm going to show some actual experiments. The first is an urban reuse experiment. This is in real property. La Pépinière is in Montreal. It's a project that was founded by an architect and an economist. Their goal was to resist the commodification of urban space. They saw more and more urban spaces, and they saw the real estate economics sort of pointing towards a process of events and experiences. They saw more and more value there, and they saw more and more companies sort of thinking about commodifying urban space as experiences. So their first project, called Village au pied du courant, is temporarily transforming a disused piece of land. So this was kind of a formerly industrial piece of land. And La Pépinière created a place to do experiments and showcase the creative community. So they invited all sorts of different artists and makers and technologists to play in this space. And it connected with the neighborhood so that they could collectively define the future of that parcel. So this is a really nice, in some ways, kind of like a placemaking intervention. But in order to make it happen, they had to innovate with various workarounds and strategies. They did regulatory innovation. So there's a couple of really interesting examples. Permitting. They were not technically permitted as a fixed intervention. It was a temporary event. And this allowed a few different things. So for a liquor license, they were applying for daily licenses. Every day they were getting a new liquor license. And they weren't registering as a fixed bar, which would have cost a lot more money. But if you're applying for a day-to-day license, there's a 4-day limit for each week. And so what they did was to create 2 different bars, technically, and alternate 4 days on each side. And so every week, as you can see in this photo, there's 2 bar windows. And so the permit would actually shift back and forth between these 2. They also wanted to have kids at these event spaces. And if you have kids near alcohol, you need to have fences. But what is a fence really? They asked. So instead of putting up actual fences, they used benches, they used different lighting strategies, strings of lights, in order to partition different areas. And finally, a construction license. So instead of actually building a permanent fixed thing, which would require a construction license and it would require unions to build it, it's actually classified as an art installation. So in any case, La Pépinière highlighted these existing elements in the law. They found new space that was kind of regulatory gray area, and they pushed outward. They created precedents that are now part of the law. And they did this through a grant and a bit of a relationship with the city, but really on their own. And they began sharing that best practice widely. So diagrammatically, you can think of La Pépinière doing this initiation experiment, developing design, diffusion, and pushing the boundary of regulation. Now, as they carved out that space of regulation and changed some laws and created a new normal, that was a new space of value. Now, unfortunately, that available space was quickly filled by other companies. And those companies were using the same workarounds. They were using the same regulatory strategies, and they were using some of the same, even the same visual language, but they were using it toward different goals. So this became a trend in Montreal. This is just one example of many others that was using that visual language and the same regulatory strategy. But what's interesting is that they did it with an entirely different goal. They took on corporate sponsors, and suddenly La Pépinière couldn't compete. So this was almost the opposite of the reason why La Pépinière was founded. It was commodifying urban space. And what I think is really fascinating is that this was an experiment that opened up new space of value, and that space of value couldn't be governed. It got filled and captured by other actors. So contrast that with a similar project in Amsterdam. This is a project called De Keuvel that began with a city competition. So it was right around the same time after the financial crisis, and the city issued a tender to reuse a formerly industrial and polluted parcel of land. The idea was to experiment toward broader sustainability goals and to support the creative and artist community. The winner of this competition would get the land for 10 years for free, but had to finance everything else. So this is an example. This is a bit of a video that shows you around De Keuvel, so you get a sense of it. But this project was won by a group of architects, designers, and sustainability firms. So this winning proposal involved a planting strategy, which very inexpensively remediated the soil. So it cleaned up the pollution in the soil over that 10-year period, that long period of time. And they used old houseboats, broken houseboats, as artist studios. So they pulled up these houseboats on land and got people to reconfigure them in a DIY retrofit way. So people were able to maintain these studios. The community is off-grid mostly. It uses innovative utility strategies, to lab, to test and showcase new sustainability technologies. And all of this was in very close collaboration with the City Hall. The project team members that I interviewed stressed that the city staff felt like team members. So this is a very similar type of experiment, but it started in a different way. It started through a city competition. And crucially, this exploration, this experiment, it didn't change regulation. It was exploring new modes of value, but it didn't open up regulatory space. And it was a huge success in a lot of ways. So it unlocked a new part of the city, this area in the north, a neighborhood called Nord, and it created a new narrative for that neighborhood. It created a typology of urban experience and a best practice in close collaboration with the city. And it legitimized the project team, who went on to do a lot of other kind of follow-on projects together. This is an example of one follow-on project. I can't even hope to pronounce the name. It's something like Conceptual Shift, and it's a sustainable living community that's all in houseboats. So this is right next door to De Keuvel, and it's showcasing new architectural strategies and new property rights regimes on the water. De Keuvel also led to a manifesto for the neighborhood. So the original project team developed this manifesto, which articulates a new approach to city life that's focused on sustainability and circularity. It was signed by 8,000 households across the neighborhood of residents, as well as organizations and knowledge institutes. And finally, the city committed to this manifesto as well. After committing to the manifesto, the city built on that momentum and hired Metabolic, which was one of the original project team members. It's a sustainability design firm. The city hired Metabolic to create an entirely new master plan for the area. Instead of writing a sort of conventional master plan, Metabolic focused on principles that were in the manifesto. So this isn't a master plan, it's actually an urban framework for how to do master planning and how to do city development. And this has been incorporated by the city, and it's influencing Amsterdam's broader urban development method. Furthermore, up a scale again, this has influenced a new land use act at the national level. So the country of the Netherlands looked at this Bijkslaughterham urban framework, which inspired a new land use policy called Omgevingswet, something like this. This is a new act that bundles together hundreds of laws for intervening on land. So instead of applying for permits or sifting through hundreds, if not thousands of different provisions and technicalities, everything is bundled together and it's coordinated. It's specifically intended to stimulate sustainability projects like wind farms or things like De Keuvel. And it gives cities more discretion to decide what's needed in the city specifically. So instead of having to go up or down a level in order to get permissions for things, the city is a one-stop shop for deciding how to experiment towards these societal goals. So as you can see at the bottom here, and this is a quote from the policy, the emphasis is placed on goals, not the means to attain them. So the attitude is yes if instead of no unless. It's creating space for companies and organizations to come up with ideas. So not only is the Netherlands incorporating this new land use policy, they're actually experimenting toward that policy, which will be officially implemented in 2021. So working backwards from that, this plan builds on previous experiments. It reduces unnecessary rules and procedures, and it has this interim period for cities and towns across the Netherlands to practice with the policy. So if you want to do a project that fits in with this future policy that will be in effect in 2021, you can actually apply for an exemption now. So again, this is a very staged regulatory revision process. So from these two experiments, from La Pépinière and from De Keuvel, you can see that experiments aren't just about developing new technology. They're about the future value of a potential parcel. So regulation is not the same as normalization. La Pépinière was simultaneously restructuring both regulation and norms. Everything happened at once. It created a new value space, but it didn't set up the conditions for diffusion or regulation. It defaulted to the market state framework. De Keuvel, on the other hand, was a close collaboration without immediately changing the law. So norms and strategies were developed, and then regulation and plans came later and slowly incorporated across scales and across sectors. This is a way to move forward towards positive system value slowly and in a measured sense, which is the second point, this idea that we slowly integrate across different scales and sectors. You can think of all sorts of different outcomes from any given set of experiments. So I also want to show experiments in mobility. This is perhaps a familiar thing. I don't know if they have these scooters in Saint Petersburg yet, but in Boston last summer, there was a rogue deployment of bird scooters in Cambridge and Somerville, which are towns right next to Boston, but overlapping and connecting with Boston. So in Massachusetts, there's a regulatory gray area. At the state level, the state forbids these scooters, but they only can control those scooters on streets. At the same time, cities control sidewalks and parking spaces. So these two photos actually show two different jurisdictions, two regimes of control over these scooters. On the one hand, you have a scooter parked on a sidewalk. On the other hand, you have a guy scooting down the street. So Bird deployed these scooters. They dropped a few hundred of them, a flock of birds, on Cambridge and Somerville. And those two cities invoked what's technically a food truck law. So this idea that cities can control commercial activity in public space, on sidewalks and in parking spaces. And they used that to impound the scooters. So here you can see a screenshot that I took with some colleagues of the scooters, and they're actually in the Department of Public Works, and their batteries are just kind of draining as they sit there. It's unclear whether those cities were allowed legally to impound the scooters, according to Massachusetts state law. But another thing that's important to notice here is that they didn't deploy in Boston. So Boston had a bit of time, and they thought, okay, we need to figure out what we're going to do about these scooters, which are probably coming down the pipeline. This is an example of imminent technology. So Boston's new urban mechanics spearheaded an anticipatory policy to gain leverage before these scooters arrived. This was passed finally in March of this year, in 2019. And here you can see the ordinance, which gives Boston the legal power to issue licenses to scooter companies, to define performance and operating criteria for those licenses, and to impound or enforce the rules of those licenses. So here you can see kind of what happened. There was an anticipatory policy in Boston. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of towns in the Boston area that touch. So there's Cambridge and Somerville. There's also a town called Brookline right nearby. At first, these cities started doing collaborative regional coordination to develop a policy that kind of crossed these different cities, which makes sense because if you're driving down the street, the laws shouldn't change as you move from one block to the next. But all of a sudden, Brookline decided to do its own experiment. So Boston had an anticipatory policy. Brookline went a bit rogue and did their own experiment. They created an exception, and they invited scooter companies, Bird and Lime and a couple others, to deploy in the city of Brookline. Here you can see those Lime scooters on the sidewalk in Brookline, and crucially, they have not yet approached Boston. So these scooter companies still can't figure out if they have a viable business model in Boston. They don't know about network density. They don't know about the condition of the streets. They don't know if people will like them. And so they're waiting to figure out whether or not they're going to deploy in Boston. So right now in the area, we have a stalemate. We have some experiments happening, a bit rogue, a bit patchwork. And this policy is never really going to be able to keep up with the development of scooter technology if we can't coordinate, if we can't figure out how to experiment together. Again, contrast that with the case of Amsterdam. So in Amsterdam, the same year, a very similar thing happened. There was a rogue deployment of O-bikes, Flick bikes, Donkey Republic, a few others, in the city of Amsterdam. Here you can see this is one of the main national newspapers called Het Parool, and they published an article that says bicycle-shaped objects flood the city. Within a month, the municipality had banned those bicycles. They decided to remove and impound the bicycles after this political and public outcry. Right around the same time, Felix emerged. This is a company that creates green electric scooters, and it's a shared mobility strategy, and it launched right around the same time. So technically, under the ban that Amsterdam had just issued, this was illegal, but they had a really good story, and they had really good intentions. So they petitioned to City Hall, and the city agreed to an MOU that would allow 100 scooters. The approach and the mentality that all of my interviews kept saying was that this is gedogen, which is the same principle in Amsterdam that applies to smoking marijuana. Technically illegal, but everyone looks the other way, and it kind of keeps happening. So you have this gedogen approach to Felix that allows 100 scooters to start operating. Now, the city didn't just turn the other way. They didn't just say, hey, you can use 100 scooters and we'll let you do it. At the same time, they organized dozens of shared micromobility experiments. So these tests were to figure out if different companies can and should compete with Felix, of course, if there should be maybe bikes, if they should be shared small cars. But they actually had a more important goal in mind. These experiments were set to advance an ambitious smart mobility policy that by 2030, the city of Amsterdam would be car-free-ish. The idea was to promote behavior change and test if people are willing to leave behind their cars. These mobility experiments are really tests about human behavior. Here you can see a diagram. Felix and O-Bike start, O-Bike gets stopped, Felix kind of jumps over through this negotiation experiment. So they're able to advance the design of their technology, to think about the diffusion, to think about how this should be sort of operated in the city of Amsterdam. And it allows for the city to deliberate whether or not this is a technology we like. This leads to a new smart mobility policy that offers a few licenses to a few companies to operate a shared mobility platform like Felix or like any of the other shared mobility platforms. At the same time, there was a whole new set of projects and a whole new set of experiments that started happening in parallel. These also were developing the design of technology. They were thinking about diffusion and deliberation, but they led to an entirely new concept, which is e-bird hubs. So they found that people are willing to ditch their cars. And the real issue here is crowded streets and overcrowding in public space, and reliably finding a vehicle quickly. So your commute kind of depends on being able to find a scooter or a shared car quickly. That's the real issue here. And this is exactly the issue that companies like Bird and like O-Bike were trying to solve through flooding the marketplace. They were trying to solve the reliability problem. So the city, through these experiments, realized the reliability problem can actually be solved in different ways through this e-bird hub strategy. E-bird hubs are these micromobility sharing zones at the neighborhood level. So the city is going to issue an RFP to identify preferred providers and articulate performance criteria for those providers. So in 15 or 20 neighborhoods, you're going to have these little shared mobility hubs that offer bikes, cargo bikes, scooters, even small cars. Everything has to be electric and shared and integrated through a mobility as a service app. And the city is going to create this menu of providers. So this required an entirely new procurement strategy. The city had to think about, how do we procure a technology, but really just put it on a menu that we offer to residents so they can decide, hey, we want Felix, we want O-Bike, and we want Car2Go. What's also interesting is that this adds to the number of licenses that a company like Felix, or it adds to the number of vehicles that a company like Felix would be able to put in Amsterdam under a license. So it's actually a win for the company, and it's a win for the city, and it's a win for residents. So again, with some lessons. It's important to test hypotheses toward ambitious societal goals. So not only are we doing experiments, not only are we letting things happen in ways that perhaps regulation would have forbidden before, but we're thinking about that and its ultimate goal. We're using experiments to observe behavior change and patterns of use. And we're using experiments to inform new policy and new products. Again, just like de Koivel did and informed a new policy at many different levels. And finally, it's important to look at the effects that a technology will have, not just the technology itself. So think about the effects like overcrowding of streets. Think about this idea of realizing that it's the reliability problem that really needs to be solved. One solution is obviously to flood the cities. The other solution is an entirely new concept of these micromobility hubs. So good experiments are opening us up to new solutions that might be something different than the original technology that prompted the experiment. So in conclusion, kind of tying some of these threads together, when we think about urban experimentation, this is a new practice, a new set of strategies that's generating technology itself. Urban experiments are also generating governmentality. So whether we like it or not, whether we're intentional about it or not, experiments are where the way things are governed is getting sorted out. This could be through specific and official regulations, or through normalizing new behaviors and showing new space of value that can be captured within existing regulations. So experiments are restructuring our economic, social, and technical relations. But in most cases, the aftermath of experiments, the ways that they're restructuring those relations, are not being considered. And I believe that effective experimentation will engage with that future value, will specifically set out to think about how the value of cities should be governed with and through the experimentation process to figure that out. So this is going to require a conceptual and a strategic shift. Firstly, conceptually, we need to think differently about technology than we think about the value that it creates. We need to think about people making short trips without polluting, instead of thinking about scooters. We need to think about neighborhoods deciding the future of a parcel instead of thinking about seasonal event spaces. This is really important for emerging and solicited technology, so that you can design and deliberate toward value goals without jumping to a specific technology solution. It's also really important for imminent technology that's coming down the pipeline, so that you can regulate the outcomes, not the technology itself. If you think about the outcomes instead of the technology, you can develop more appropriate regulation that might get at the underlying issues. So this is a more robust and a future-proof policy strategy. So in the case of dockless scooters, cities are always playing catch-up to try and create a regulation that specifically points to small mobility devices that have a motor that operates at this RPM with this kind of range up to this speed, whatever. And to continually revise policy and try to define technology in that policy means that you're always going to be playing catch-up. But if you're thinking about the outcomes, if you're thinking about the actual value, or value in different types of ways, you're not going to be always playing catch up against technology. So this can also be advanced through a strategic shift, which is to embed experiments into longer experimentation portfolios. So instead of thinking about a single bounded experiment like La Pépinière in Montreal, it was about a single experiment that opened up regulation and that value was captured. Instead, you should think about these ongoing portfolios that explore a question, develop an answer, and explore the next question. These become long chains of creating and governing value in cities with technology. So this allows you to separate normalization from legalization. So you're mitigating this kind of cat out of the bag effect that happened with La Pépinière. You're separating technology development from value capture. So instead of thinking about negotiations as zero-sum games in which there's a winner and a loser, by separating technology development from value capture, you're able to advance both simultaneously, and they can actually both add to each other. It allows you to align the timescales of regulation and technology, so mitigating this pacing problem of cities always playing catch-up, and it allows unexpected solutions. So as you advance through an experimentation portfolio, you might end up at an entirely different end state than where you initially set out. So this mitigates vendor lock-in. It mitigates a lot of the problems of procurement, where you have to define ex ante the technology that you're going to want to procure and the outcome that you're going to be paying for. So learning from the Amsterdam cases that I showed, in Amsterdam, this was enabled by 3 structural pillars at the city. So firstly, the city uses a thesis-led policy strategy. So policies actually initiate experiments, but they also emerge from experiments. So in the case of De Kuyvel, it was a policy called Broodplaatsen, which initiated the experiment, but also from the experiment, they developed an entirely new land use policy. Secondly, the CTO office in the city of Amsterdam internally reports portfolios. So instead of being accountable for a specific project, which may or may not fail, a specific experiment, which may or may not lead to a procurement, the CTO office is responsible for a portfolio, for a whole learning agenda. which allows them to fail. It allows them to be more nimble and redirect the avenues of the project. And finally, experimental procurement. So the city is actually able to pay for experiments. They're able to pay for the future possibility of value that exists between the city and a private sector actor, for example. The city is able to pay for shared knowledge and trust and co-creation, instead of actually having to procure a specific thing that creates a particular outcome. So let's go back to this framework, this experimentation framework. It seems that this indeed is a robust strategy that a lot of cities are using, and it's allowing for the design and in some cases the deliberation of new technology. But here's the twist. All of the above is operating within the established state market paradigm. It's still government on this side and technology companies on this side. So if we do all of this really well, even if we run the best possible experiments, it'll create the more effective regulation. It'll create potentially more nimble public-private partnerships. It might even create more responsible city technology. And that's not a trivial outcome. I think we need to keep doing this and keep doing it well and keep doing it better. But in this case, urban experiments are simply the front of normalization. They're not changing the existing system. They're not questioning the underlying paradigms of how cities are being governed. They're a front of normalization. Yeah, maybe they're helping us deal with autonomous vehicles. They're helping us develop a policy. They're even helping us design new technology, but they're just putting those technology into the existing framework. It's a new interface between public and private sectors. And in that way, it's kind of a refreshed public-private partnership. So I believe that the true promise of urban experimentation is actually to leap over, to jump past that binary of market and state. So in the future, I want to suggest to you that we need to shift experimentation to the conceptual center of these different questions. So experimentation should be the way that we approach design. It should be the way that we deliberate, the way that we diffuse technology, the way that we regulate technology. It's a tool to legitimately ask and answer the question of civic futures with technology. So it shifts us away from assuming the state or the market has given answers to questions of regulation, for example. It doesn't always have to be government doing regulation. If we design together, maybe regulation can be inbuilt in the way that a technology is designed. It can be a self-regulating form of technology. You might even be able to deliberate without state logic, to deliberate without market logic. See, in many cases with technologies, the deliberation happens through market logic. If there's a market for it, if there's customers, if people will pay, hey, it's a good thing. And in other cases, deliberation is only vested in the state. Think about zoning for land use. This is always traditionally thought of as a state function. So if we design together, if we use experimentation as a tool and shift it to the conceptual center of these questions, perhaps we can use the experiment to diffuse, to regulate, to deliberate, to design. So if we're able to do that, if we're able to centralize experimentation in this process of statecraft, of city making, the direction of progress is led by the hypotheses of any given experiment, hypotheses around what might be better. So the arrow of the direction of technology and the direction of society is more fluid. It can shift as a function of any given experiment that we use to ask a question about civic futures. Experiments are about testing hypotheses, and then they're about effectively stewarding the value that emerges from the experiment. So as I showed before, in many cases, the emergent value is not being dealt with. The experiment sort of creates new value, opens up new territory, but then that value is captured into the state market system. So finally, I want to leave you with this idea of a civic corporation. So this is a new kind of organizational form that would be developed at the end of an experimentation portfolio. So after we've asked questions of design and experimented on design, after we've asked questions of how to appropriately deliberate a technology and experimented and developed a new deliberation mechanism, and the same with diffusion and the same with regulation. There's a civic corporation that exists at the end of that process, and it's different from typical for-profit or nonprofit or cooperative firms. It's separate from, but it's related to governments and from market logic. This civic corporation, which I believe in the future should be a new organizational form that deals with urban technology, it'll have a different kind of charter. So its charter will not be to maximize shareholder value, as is with a for-profit company. It won't be a particular sort of bounded mission, as with many nonprofit companies, but it will be an emergent charter that's toward social change and from social change. So it'll be a constant process of revisiting the charter in the direction of this civic corporation. Government or governance of this corporation will be cross-sectoral. You could imagine governance being moderated by having different sort of existing sector actors sitting on a governance panel. Regulation will be integral to the operation of the company. So instead of having this tense relationship between a company that exists to navigate through regulation and government which exists to structure regulation, regulation will actually be inbuilt, having emerged from the experimentation process. Funding will be for outcomes like a social impact bond or like different kinds of sort of municipal bond mechanisms. And it could even be crowdfunded. So it's accountable to the stakeholders that it will ultimately affect. And finally, the idea of time horizons. So I think that in many cases, the reasons why for-profit companies make the decisions they do is because in addition to funding and governance and the regulatory regimes, they also have a specific kind of time horizon that they're operating on in terms of showing financial success. A civic corporation would operate on a much shorter time horizon on one hand. So it might exist to satisfy a specific goal, like becoming car-free-ish, and then it will sunset. Or it will have a particularly long time horizon, say on 50, 100-year time scales. And in this case, it'll be much more like a utility. It'll be like the electricity grid, or it'll be like other forms of utility that operate on much longer time horizons. This makes sense for real property, which in many cases, you can see things like soil remediation happening only if you think on 50 and 100-year time horizons. So in conclusion, I really urge us to think more critically and more creatively about this process of urban experimentation. This research is all new. It's all happening right now. It's happening in real time. Cities are doing this, and they're structuring their practices in an ad hoc way. And I think it's our responsibility as people who are invested in the future of cities and the future of technology to think critically about governance regimes, about design, about regulation, and to think not only critically, but also creatively, to be thinking about how new forms like a civic corporation can actually leap past and go beyond existing frameworks like the often tense market and state framework. So with that, I welcome questions. I'm really eager to hear from you. I'm eager to hear from your experience and your thoughts on this emerging space. And I welcome you to co-create it together. Thank you.